She built a billion-dollar empire from nothing, and in 60 seconds, one man tried to burn it to the ground in front of everyone. A packed Seattle Café, a ruthless financier who knew exactly where to strike. Confidential documents soaked in spilled coffee, and not one person in that room had the courage to stand up, except a quiet man in the corner, a single father with a sleeping past. What happened next would change both their lives forever. If you're new here, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like this video so more people find us. Now stay with me. This one goes deep. The rain had been falling since before dawn. The soft cinematic kind of rain that makes Seattle look romantic on postcards, but the cold, indifferent kind that soaks through the collar of your coat before you've made it half a block from your car. The kind of rain that makes the whole city feel like it's sighing. By 7:43 in the morning, Celeste Arden had already been awake for 4 hours. She'd taken a call from her CFO at 3:50 a.m. about a capital allocation discrepancy that turned out to be a clerical error. She'd reviewed 17 pages of due diligence materials for the Meridian acquisition. She'd exchanged 11 text messages with her legal team about a regulatory filing that wasn't due for 3 weeks, but that she wanted to be ready for anyway, because that was how she'd kept Arden Nexus alive this long, by being ready before everyone else even knew there was something to prepare for. She just wanted coffee. Not coffee delivered to her desk by her assistant. Coffee in a to-go cup handed through a car window by a driver. Just coffee, sitting down in a place where nobody knew her name or needed anything from her for 15 minutes. She pushed open the door of Halcyon Grounds, a narrow, unremarkable little cafe 3 blocks from her office that she'd discovered 18 months ago during a walk she'd taken specifically to avoid a board pre-meeting she was dreading, and she felt something in her shoulders drop. Nobody looked up when she walked in. That alone was worth the detour. She ordered a medium dark roast, refused a sleeve for the cup because she liked the warmth against her palms, and found a corner table near the window. The folder she pulled from her bag was thick acquisition strategy materials, investor communication drafts, preliminary term sheets. She wasn't supposed to have printed copies. Technically, those documents existed only on secured servers accessible through two-factor authentication. But Celeste thought better on paper. She always had. Yes, cheat. She'd scribbled the first business plan for Arden Nexus on the back of a grocery list when she was 22 years old, sitting on the floor of a studio apartment that smelled like her neighbor's cooking and old carpet. Paper was how she thought. She spread the pages out, wrapped both hands around her cup, and let herself breathe. At the table near the door, a man sat alone with a paperback novel and what looked like a half-eaten blueberry muffin. He was in his early 30s. She guessed lean, but not in a gym-obsessive way. Just the kind of build that suggested his body had been asked to do real things at some point. Dark hair that wasn't particularly styled. A gray Henley under an open flannel. He had the look of someone who was genuinely, contentedly reading, which struck Celeste as slightly remarkable because genuine contentment was not something she saw on many adult faces. She noticed him the way you notice furniture that fits a room well. He belonged there. She went back to her documents. She managed 11 minutes. She heard the door open and felt the temperature shift before she looked up. Gideon Rourke walked into Halcyon Grounds like he owned it, which was consistent with how Gideon Rourke walked into most places. He was 51 years old, built like a former athlete who'd since discovered expense account dinners, and he had the kind of financial pedigree that made certain rooms go quiet when he entered. Old money augmented by predatory deal-making. A reputation for identifying distressed companies and either bleeding them or breaking them, depending on which was more efficient. Celeste had met him exactly twice in professional settings. Both times she had left the room feeling like she needed a shower. She didn't move, didn't look away from her documents. If she appeared absorbed enough, maybe, well, his voice carried easily over the cafe noise, the way voices do when their owners have never learned to modulate them around other people. Celeste Arden, hiding from your shoulders already. She looked up slowly, keeping her face neutral. Years of board meetings had taught her that the first expression you showed was the one people remembered. Gideon. He was already walking toward her, His two security personnel, large, silent men in dark coats, positioned themselves without being asked. One near the counter, one 2 steps behind Gideon. The kind of arrangement that felt theatrical in a neighborhood cafe, but was probably reflexive at this point. I didn't realize you frequented this part of the city. He looked around with the mild contempt of a man evaluating property he wouldn't bother to buy. Quaint. I like the coffee. He stopped at the edge of her table, glancing down at her documents with the exaggerated casualness of someone who absolutely had already read everything they were pretending not to examine. Acquisition materials. Ambitious. For a company with your current capital exposure. Her jaw tightened. Just slightly. You can't read those from where you're standing. I don't need to. He smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. I've been watching Arden Nexus for months, Celeste. I know your exposure better than your CFO does. I know which of your institutional investors have been losing patience. Which of your board members are starting to whisper about leadership stability, about the regulatory inquiry that hasn't gone public yet. Something cold dropped through her chest. The regulatory inquiry was not public. It had been filed 11 days ago, and beyond her legal team and 2 board members, nobody should have known. You're bluffing, she said. $31 million of unresolved investor commitments. A coup who hasn't hit a single operational benchmark in 6 quarters. A merger target that 3 firms already passed on. He tilted his head. Should I keep going? The cafe had gotten quieter. Silent coffee grinders. Still Rand's music still played from the small speaker behind the counter, but the human noise had lowered. People were listening without looking. Celeste was aware suddenly of how visible she was. Her documents on the table. Her face, which she was fighting to keep controlled. Her hands around a cup in a corner cafe, like any other working professional, except that she was not any other working professional, and this man was doing this deliberately, publicly as a message. Whatever you think you know about my company, I think your acquisition will fail. His voice was pleasant, almost conversational. I think you'll close that deal at a premium you can't sustain. Your investors will lose confidence, and within 18 months, Arden Nexus will be exactly the kind of distressed asset that's very interesting to the right kind of buyer. People like you. People who see opportunity where sentiment has clouded judgment. He reached forward, almost gently, and picked up the ceramic mug from the edge of his security guard's tray. The man had apparently ordered something at the counter without Celeste noticing, and then he set it down directly on top of her document stack. Quite a threat. A demonstration. I'd be careful with those, Gideon said softly. Confidential materials in a public space. That's the kind of carelessness that board members mention in closed-door conversations. He tipped the mug, not violently, just a casual, deliberate shift of his wrist, the way you'd knock over a piece in a chess game. You'd already decided you were winning. The coffee poured across 6 pages of acquisition term sheets. Dark, spreading fast. Celeste's hand shot out on instinct, pulling the documents back, pressing her napkin against the pages. But the damage was already spreading, and her hands were shaking, and Gideon was watching her scramble with an expression she would remember for a very long time. Because it wasn't triumph or anger, it was boredom. She was a problem he was solving, an annoyance he was managing. Around the cafe, nobody moved. A woman at a nearby table looked away. The barista behind the counter stared at the espresso machine. The security guard near the door looked at nothing. Gideon's guard, the one nearest to Celeste, took a single step forward, touching anyone. Just closing the distance, making the space smaller. I'd think carefully about your next few months, Gideon said. Seriously, I'm offering perspective, sir. The voice came from the table near the door. That was the first thing. Not loud, not aggressive, just an ordinary speaking voice that happened to have no uncertainty in it whatsoever. The man with the paperback was standing now. He'd set his book down face open, which struck Celeste later as a strange detail to notice, like he expected to come back to it in a minute. He was looking at Gideon's security guard, the one who'd stepped closer. That's close enough, the man said. The guard, who was 4 inches taller and 60 pounds heavier, looked at this man in a gray Henley and a flannel shirt with the professional contempt of someone who dealt with nuisances for a living. Step back, sir. I'm not in your way. The man's voice was still calm. still conversational. But you're in hers. This isn't your business. You made it the whole cafe's business when you walked in. His eyes moved from the guard to Gideon, slow and direct. There was nothing hostile in the look. It was almost worse than hostile. It was assessing, clinical, the kind of look that made you feel like you'd just been categorized and filed away. She didn't invite you. You came over and started talking at her. Your man there spilled coffee on her work. That's a problem. Gideon turned his full attention to the man for the first time, and Celeste watched his expression shift through several states in rapid succession: irritation, appraisal, recalibration. And you are? Nobody you need to know. Then I'd strongly suggest you sit back down. I'm good standing. The guard moved. Not aggressively, just shifted his weight, adjusted his positioning, the specific body language of a large man accustomed to using size as punctuation. He reached out, not to grab, just to redirect a hand toward the man's shoulder. The man in the flannel moved his arm in what looked, from a distance, like barely anything. A small deflection, a re-angle of his body weight. The guard's hand found nothing. His balance shifted unexpectedly, and he had to take 2 quick steps to the side to keep from stumbling. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight scene. It just looked like a very quiet man who happened to know exactly where to be and where not to be. The guard straightened, reassessed, didn't move again. That's enough, the man said, and it was addressed to the room as much as anyone specific. Then he looked directly at Gideon Rourke. Time to go. Excuse me? You said what you came to say. She heard you. You're done. A pause. There's no version of what happens next that works out well for you. I want you to understand that before you make a decision. The cafe was almost completely silent now. Gideon Rourke had not been spoken to like this in years, possibly decades. Celeste could see it in the tension around his mouth, the slight flush at his collar. He was calculating the cost of escalating, the optics of backing down, the very public nature of the room around him. He looked at his guard. The guard gave him the smallest shake of his head. Gideon straightened his jacket. I hope you'll consider what I've said, Celeste. His voice was controlled and almost pleasant again, as if the last 2 minutes had been a minor administrative interruption. Offer of perspective stands. He turned and walked out. His guards followed. The door closed. For 3 seconds, nobody in the cafe did anything. The woman who'd looked away quietly started crying just a few tears, the released tension of witnessing something that had sat on the edge of violence without tipping over. And the barista said, "Oh my God," under his breath. And the ordinary noise of the room reassembled itself. The man in the flannel sat back down. He picked up his book. Celeste stood there for a moment with soaked acquisition documents, dripping coffee onto the cafe floor. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her heart had not. She gathered the ruined pages and walked to his table. She didn't know why. She was not the kind of person who walked up to strangers. She had executive coaches who helped her manage the social architecture of every important conversation in her professional life. She had people. But something about the way he'd already gone back to his book, like it was just over, like it had been a minor logistical issue now resolved, pulled at something in her that she couldn't quite name. "Excuse me," she said. He looked up. His eyes were a medium gray-brown, she noticed, and they had that same quality. His voice had quiet, but not vacant. Someone was definitely home. "You okay?" The question was so direct and so uncomplicated that she almost didn't know what to do with it. Most people in her life asked questions with layers in them. He just asked. "I think so," she said. "My documents are destroyed." He glanced at the soaked pages. "Those are gone. They're confidential." She heard herself say it and felt faintly ridiculous. She was the founder and CEO of a billion-dollar technology company. She had just been publicly humiliated in a neighborhood cafe by a man who apparently knew things about her company. He had no legitimate way of knowing, and she was standing here, telling a stranger that her documents were confidential, as if that was the relevant issue. She sat down across from him without being invited. He didn't seem to mind. "Do you know who that was?" she asked. "Idea." He folded the corner of his page down a dog ear, which told her something, and closed the book. "Gideon Rourke. He runs a private investment and acquisition firm. He has a reputation for identifying struggling companies and positioning himself to acquire them at a discount. And he thinks your company is struggling. My company is not struggling. The response was immediate and reflexive, and she heard how it sounded defensive, which was the last thing she wanted to be, and made herself slow down. There are pressures. Every company has pressures. He was exaggerating our exposure to make a point. What point? She looked at him. That he can. The man was quiet for a moment, turning that over. What was the regulatory inquiry he mentioned? Her expression must have shifted because he held up one hand. Not my business. No, she stopped. You were listening to that conversation. Hard not to. He wasn't exactly whispering, true. Gideon had wanted to be heard. The public nature of it had been the whole point. It's a regulatory filing. A complaint, technically. Someone filed it 11 days ago, and it hasn't been made public. The way he said it, she paused, pulling that detail back out. He wasn't guessing. He knew. Which means someone inside my company told him. The man in the flannel looked at her with the same assessing, direct quality that had been directed at Gideon 20 minutes ago. And Celeste felt briefly like she was being very carefully listened to, which was something she was not entirely used to. How many people knew about it? He asked. My legal team lead, 2 board members, and my COO. Yes, he'd intervened. He didn't respond immediately. He was thinking, and he thought the way she'd noticed certain engineers think quietly with focus, not performing the process of thinking for the room. That's a small group, he finally said. Yes. She picked at the edge of her coffee-soaked document without looking at it. It is. Neither of them said the obvious thing. She became aware that she had been sitting at a stranger's table for nearly 7 minutes, and she didn't know his name. I'm Celeste, she said. He considered her briefly, as if calibrating what to do with that information. Do you work around here, Grant? Security consulting. Office is about 4 blocks east. And she glanced at the place where Gideon's guard had been standing. At the almost invisible thing Grant had done with his arm and body weight. Wasn't security consulting. He almost smiled. Quite. Old habits. She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Can I ask what made you stand up? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, rain ran down the window in crooked lines. The guard moved toward you, he said. Before he moved toward me. Wasn't going to sit there and watch that happen. It was such a simple answer. No heroism in it. No posturing. She nodded slowly. Well, thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. That man is going to be angrier in an hour than he was when he walked out. The coffee on your documents, that was a message about control. He'll look for other ways to send the same message. She looked at him. You got all of that from a cafe confrontation. He picked up his book again. I got all of that from watching how he moved. He paused. Go save your documents. Whatever you can rescue from the coffee. She stood feeling oddly steadied, like she'd been slightly off balance since Gideon had walked in and now the floor was level again. Fixed nothing was fixed but level. Grant, she said. He looked up. He's going to come after you too, you know, for intervening. He looked back at his book with the expression of a man for whom this information was filing itself neatly into an existing category. Probably. Doesn't that bother you? He considered this with what seemed like genuine seriousness, and then he said, I've got a daughter. 8 years old. I've got a job. I've got a book I'm trying to finish. He turned the page. A man like that's an inconvenience. There's a difference. Celeste Arden picked up her ruined documents, ordered a second coffee she barely tasted, and walked back to Arden Nexus in the, rain, thinking about a man who called Gideon Rourke an inconvenience. She was still thinking about it 3 days later when Gideon's lawyers contacted her office. And she was still thinking about it 4 days after that, when she found out what Grant Holloway had done before he became a security consultant. When she found out what he used to be, because that was the piece that made everything else make why a man who called himself nobody important had known exactly where to stand, exactly how to move, exactly what to say to make a room full of witnesses feel like the threat was already over before it had properly begun. Grant Holloway had not always been a quiet man sitting in corner cafes with borrowed paperbacks and half-eaten muffins. He had been, for 11 years, something else entirely. Whatever that thing had cost him, and it had cost him, she would come to understand that it had left him with the kind of stillness that isn't peace exactly. It's the other kind of quiet. The kind that knows what noise sounds like before it arrives. The lawyers moved fast. Celeste found out about the legal correspondence sent to Grant's address on a Wednesday morning, 4 days after the café, when her own legal team forwarded her a copy of the complaint that Gideon Rourke's attorneys had filed with a private dispute resolution firm. It named Grant Holloway as the primary subject: assault, interference, unlawful physical contact with a security professional, and it named Celeste Arden as a secondary party, alleging that she had instigated the confrontation by failing to remove herself from a public space when asked to do so by a private citizen. She read that last part twice. Failing to remove herself from a public space. She had been sitting in a cafe drinking coffee. Her attorney, Marcus Vale, a careful, deliberate man who had been practicing corporate civil law for 26 years, and who chose his words the way other people chose real estate, read the filing and said, "It's thin. It's designed to be expensive, not to win." Meaning what? Whoever filed this isn't expecting a judgment. They're expecting the process itself to be the punishment. He set the folder on her conference table. Legal fees, depositions, the distraction of response preparation. Rourke has done this before. He files, he waits, the other side spends money and energy defending something that was never real to begin with, and by the time it's dismissed, the damage is already done. And Grant Holloway? Marcus looked at her carefully. What about him? He's a private citizen, single father, security consultant. He doesn't have corporate legal infrastructure. He doesn't have she stopped. This filing will cost him money he probably doesn't have allocated for legal defense. That's likely the intention, yes. She looked out the window at the rain, which had barely let up since Tuesday. Find out who his attorney is, if he has one. Celeste. He stood up in a cafe because a manned security guard moved toward me, Marcus. The least I can do is make sure he doesn't get buried in legal fees because of it. Marcus wrote something down without further comment. She reached Grant Holloway by phone that afternoon. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised her. She'd half-expected voicemail, some professional answering service, the buffer layer that most people in his line of work kept between themselves and incoming calls. Just his last name. Not hello, not a complete sentence. She found she respected that immediately. "It's Celeste Arden," she said, from the cafe. A pause, not a surprised pause. More like a brief recalibration. "Who you are. Then you probably know why I'm calling." The filing, his voice was flat. "I got a copy this morning. My attorney says it's designed to drain rather than win. I figured that out." He was quiet for a moment, and she heard something in the background. Small, distant voices. Something that sounded like a cartoon. Hang on a second. A shuffle. A door closing. The cartoon sounds fading. Lily's home. She had a half day. How old did you say she was? Another pause shorter. "Listen, I've dealt with legal pressure before. It's irritating but manageable. I'd like to cover your legal costs." She hadn't expected the refusal to be that immediate. She was accustomed to negotiating from a second or third position, not from the starting line. "Mr. Holloway." "Grant, you're facing these costs because of something you did to help me. That's not a dynamic I'm comfortable with. I'm facing these costs because Gideon Rourke is the kind of man who punishes people for not letting him do whatever he wants." His voice didn't rise. If anything, it lowered slightly. Those are two different things. He'd have found some reason to come at me regardless. "That's not, I don't want your money, Ms. Arden. A beat. I mean that without any particular attitude. I just don't want it." She sat with that for a moment. In her experience, people who said they didn't want something almost always meant they wanted it offered differently. But there was nothing in his voice that suggested negotiation. He meant it the way he'd said it, plainly, without subtext. "All right," she said. He seemed slightly surprised that she didn't push. "All right, I heard you." She shifted the phone to her other ear. "Can I ask you something else?" "Sure. What did you do before security consulting?" The pause this time was different from the others. Not evasive, exactly more like he was deciding which version of a true answer to give. "Navy," he said finally. "For a while. How long is a while?" 11 years. She let that sit. "What did you do in the Navy for 11 years? Pause. She could hear him breathing. Outside her office window, a delivery truck was backing up below, its warning signal a distant, rhythmic beep. "Things that made me pretty good at reading rooms," he said at last. "That's probably the most useful." Summary. She understood that he was not going to say more, and she understood why, and she filed it away. There's something I want to discuss with you. Not on the phone. What kind of something? A professional opportunity. Related to what's happening with Rourke. She paused. What happened in that cafe wasn't random, Grant. He knew things about my company that he shouldn't have known. Confidential things. The regulatory filing. Investor positioning. He quoted internal numbers I haven't made public. Someone inside Arden Nexus is feeding him information, and I don't know who, and I don't know how deep it goes. The quality of his silence changed. It went from careful to focused, and she could feel the difference even through a phone line. How many people have access to all of those specifics? He asked. That's exactly what I need help figuring out. Ms. Arden, Celeste. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it. You have a company with what? 400 employees? 437. You have a legal team, a security department, HR, probably a board with its own governance structure. You have resources I don't have. I have resources, she agreed. What I don't have is someone who walked into a room with Gideon Rourke and read him in about 45 seconds without knowing who he was. She let that settle. My internal security team is good at protecting servers. My board is good at governance. My legal team's good at filing responses. None of them are good at what you did in that cafe. What did I do in that cafe? You saw the whole thing before anyone else did. She glanced down at the legal filing on her desk. I need that. He said he'd think about it. She took that as a better answer than no. In the meantime, the pressure on Arden Nexus continued with the quiet persistence of water finding cracks. Regulatory intervened. The regulatory complaint filed with the Federal Trade Commission under an obscure competitive practice provision remained officially open, and while Celeste's legal team had already begun building their response, the existence of an open federal inquiry was not something that stayed quiet in the financial community for long. By the end of the week, 2 institutional investors had requested emergency update calls. One of them, a mid-sized asset management firm out of Boston called Hargrove Capital, which held a 7% stake in Arden Nexus, sent a letter to the board requesting a special review session regarding leadership decision-making in light of recent developments. Recent developments. Celeste read that phrase standing in her kitchen at 11:15 on a Thursday night. Still in her work clothes, eating cereal because she hadn't had time to figure out dinner, and the cereal box was already on the counter. The phrase covered everything and specified nothing. It was the kind of language that communicated a great deal while committing to very little, which was, she had come to understand how institutional investors expressed doubt without legal exposure. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Warren Pike. She answered Warren. I just saw the Hargrove letter. He sounded tired. Her CEO was 61 years old, had been in the technology sector for 30 years, and tonight he sounded every one of those years. This is getting aggressive. Yes. Celeste, I think we need to discuss whether the Meridian acquisition timeline needs to adjust. If Hargrove is rattled enough to request a board review session, the Meridian acquisition doesn't adjust. She set down her cereal spoon. That's exactly what this pressure is designed to make us do. Pull back. Look uncertain. Give Rourke's narrative about my leadership traction. I understand that. But if we close the acquisition while there's an open federal inquiry and an institutional investor rattling the board, we're giving people ammunition. A pause. I'm not saying retreat, I'm saying timing. Timing is retreat when it's based on manufactured pressure. Celeste, I'll call Hargrove personally tomorrow morning. I'll walk them through the regulatory filing and our response. Hear from me directly, not through board minutes and press releases. She moved to the window, looking out at the street below. A cab rolled through a puddle. Streetlights reflected in ripples. Who told you about the Hargrove letter? I just received it. A beat. Small. She might not have noticed it if she hadn't been paying close attention. I have a contact on their advisory board. He called me as a courtesy. Who is it? Just someone I've known for years. Business relationship. His voice was easy, unhurried. Warren Pike was exceptionally good at sounding unhurried. Was one of the things she'd valued most in him when she'd hired him 8 years ago. Read anything into it. These networks exist for a reason. She didn't push. Get some sleep, she said. We have a lot to do tomorrow. She hung up and stood at the window for a while longer. She thought about the conversation later, the small beat, before he named his source, the deliberate ease of his answer. No, the way he'd immediately steered toward the acquisition timeline. She thought about it, the way you sometimes notice a detail in a photograph that bothers you without knowing why, something slightly off in the geometry, a shadow that falls wrong. She thought about it, and then she called Grant Holloway. It was 11:43 at night. She was aware of that. She almost didn't call. He picked up on the third ring. His voice had the particular texture of someone who hadn't been asleep, but had been somewhere quiet. It's Celeste. I'm sorry it's late. I shouldn't. It's fine. What happened? She told him about the Hargrove letter, about Warren's call, about the small half-second pause before he'd named his source. She told him about the way the regulatory inquiry had come up in Gideon's Café conversation, and about the 4 people who'd known about it. There was a long silence when she finished. 4 people, Grant said. 4 people. And one of them called you tonight at 11 to steer you away from your acquisition timeline. She closed her eyes. Hearing it laid out that flatly made the shape of it clearer and worse at the same time. I don't have proof of anything. No, he agreed. Yet, the yet sat in the air between them, like something with weight. I'll take the job, he said. She exhaled. You said you'd think about it. I thought about it. A pause. I have conditions. Not full-time in office. Phyllis has school, she has activities, she has things I need to be present for. I work around that, not instead of it. I'm not someone's employee in the traditional sense. I'm a consultant. I set my own hours within whatever parameters we agree are reasonable. That's manageable. If there's ever a conflict between something you need and something Lily needs, Lily wins. I need you to understand that before we start, not after the first time it happens. Understood. And I work alone on the investigative piece. I'll share everything I find, but I don't work in committee. If I need access to something, I need it quickly and without 12 layers of approval. I'll designate you direct access to whatever you need. You'll have my personal authorization. Another pause. This one felt different, deliberate. One more thing. Ahead. When I tell you something is a threat, I need you to take it seriously. Evaluate it through a filter of whether it fits what you were already thinking. Weight it against whether it's what you want to hear. Just take it seriously. She thought about the cafe, about how she'd been sitting there processing Gideon's words through a framework of corporate threat assessment, what he could prove, what was bluster, what was leverage, while Grant had been watching where everyone's hands were. Deal, she said. Then I'll see you Monday. He came to Arden Nexus on a Monday morning at 9 a, and she gave him a small office on the 14th floor, which was not the floor where most of the executive team worked. He asked for that. Specifically, he didn't want to be visible in the daily traffic of senior leadership. He wanted a view of who came and went. She introduced him to her executive assistant, a composed woman named Dana Park, who had been with Celeste since the company's 2nd year, and to Marcus Vale, and to her head of internal security, a former federal agent named Trent Buckley, who shook Grant's hand with the particular directness of one professional assessing another. She did not introduce him to Warren. Not yet. For the first week, Grant said very little and observed a great deal. He reviewed 14 months of communications logs with Celeste's authorization. He cross-referenced access records for the server systems where confidential acquisition documents were stored. He mapped the overlap between Gideon Rourke's known business moves, the timeline of his positioning, his conversations with certain investment contacts, the regulatory filing date, and the internal calendar of Arden Nexus decision-making. He did all of this quietly, in his office on the 14th floor, and he was never the last one to leave the building because he had to pick Lily up from after-school care by 5:15. On Wednesday of his 2nd week, he appeared in Celeste's office at 4 in the afternoon, set a printed timeline on her desk without sitting down, and said, "Whoever's talking to Rourke has been doing it for at least 14 months. This isn't recent." She looked at the timeline. It was meticulous dates in one column, internal events in the second, Rourke's corresponding external moves in the third. The alignment was not perfect, but it was consistent enough to be intentional. 14 months, she said. The Meridian acquisition was identified as a target internally in March of last year. March 14th. She didn't have to check. We had a strategy session with the executive team. Rourke's firm began purchasing minority positions in 3 of Meridian's major suppliers in April. He tapped the timeline. 6 weeks later, she stared at the paper. He was positioning himself before I'd even approached Meridian formally. You were coming. Knew the timeline. Knew which suppliers mattered. Grant finally sat down, not in the chair across from her, but in the one against the wall, the one that faced the door. He always chose that chair. The regulatory complaint was filed 11 days after your legal team completed an internal risk assessment that identified the same regulatory exposure. That assessment was distributed to 5 people. Legal, my CFO, my 2 board liaisons, and Warren. 4 overlap with the earlier group of people who knew about the inquiry. Warren is in both groups, she said quietly. Warren is in both groups, Grant confirmed. He said it without inflection, without editorializing. Just the fact of it, set down in front of her, like the printed timeline. She stood up and walked to the window. Her office was on the 22nd floor, and on a clear day, she could see the sound. But today, the cloud cover was low and thick, and the view was just gray. I've known Warren for 8 years, she said. He was my 3rd hire. Before we had a real office. She stopped. He brought coffee to board presentations because we couldn't afford a catering service yet. I trusted him with everything. I know that, too. She turned around. You're sure? He met her eyes. Not with what I have right now. I'm not going to tell you I'm sure until I'm sure. He paused. But the pattern is pointing at someone who has been in every major strategic conversation for over a year. Someone who had access to the regulatory assessment, the acquisition strategy, the investor positioning. Someone whose external network includes contacts close to Rourke's institutional relationships. He opened the folder he'd brought in and slid a second page across her desk. Warren Pike has a consulting relationship disclosed, technically, as a board advisory arrangement with a firm called Centaura Group. Centaura Group shares 2 board members with a subsidiary of Rourke Capital Holdings. She picked up the page. Read it again. This is disclosed, she said. Warren disclosed this in a footnote of a governance filing 18 months ago, buried in a section about outside board activities, disclosed in the most technical sense of the word. Grant's voice wasn't accusatory. It was precise. The question isn't whether he told you. The question is whether you were supposed to see it. She set the page down. The rain had started again outside. She could hear it against the glass, soft and insistent, the same rain that had been falling in that cafe a week and a half ago, when everything she thought she understood about the threats to her company had turned out to be insufficient. What do you need? She said. Communication records. His email, his calendar, his external contact log for the last 18 months. The summary version, the raw data. Timestamps, metadata, the works. I'll get them to you. And I need you to not change anything. Distance yourself from him. Don't modify access levels. Say anything different than you normally would in meetings. He stood up. If he notices a shift in your behavior, anything we're building goes sideways. She nodded. One more thing. He stopped at the door. How are you holding up? The question surprised her. Because it was intrusive, it wasn't. It surprised her because in 11 days, not one person on her leadership team had asked her that. Her board members asked about stock exposure. Her legal team asked about response timelines. Her CFO asked about capital ratios. Nobody had asked how she was holding up. I've been better, she said honestly. I built this company. 14 years, every decision I've made, every risk I've taken. Every night I stayed 3 hours past the point where I should have gone home. I did it because I believed in what we were building. Yes, he'd intervened, and now someone who sat beside me for 8 years may have spent the last 14 months selling that to a man who wants to take it apart. Grant looked at her for a moment, with the same quality of attention she'd noticed in the cafe, that direct, unhurried listening. He said, that's a hard thing to sit with, but you haven't stopped working. That means something. He left. She sat with that for a while, the plainness of it, the refusal to dress it up or make it into something bigger than it was. That means something. Not a pep talk, not a motivational framework, just an observation offered without ceremony. She pulled Warren's calendar access report toward her and started reading. Gideon's lawyers filed a supplementary complaint the following Thursday. adding 3 new allegations against Grant and expanding the damages claim against Celeste's company to include reputational injury. Her legal team spent a full day preparing responses, which was a full day Celeste spent on things that mattered more. But what she hadn't anticipated was the Thursday evening call from her daughter. She didn't have a daughter. What she had was Sienna Arden, her 24-year-old niece who had lived with her for 2 years during college, after Celeste's older brother had gone through a difficult divorce, and who still called Celeste most Thursday evenings because the habit had never fully dissolved. Sienna was doing a residency in environmental policy in Washington, D.C. Sienna was generally one of the more perceptive people in Celeste's life, which was probably why Celeste answered even when she was exhausted. "You sound terrible," Sienna said by way of greeting. "Like actually worse than usual. Worse than the Q3 earnings call year. What's happening?" "A lot. Is it that Rourke thing? I saw a piece in a financial blog this afternoon suggesting Ardenexus has leadership stability concerns." A pause. "I actually threw my laptop. Please don't break your laptop for me." "Celeste, who's writing this stuff?" "Someone with access to information they shouldn't have." She was in the back of a car heading home, watching the rain-blurred city slide past. "We're working on it." "We who?" She thought about how to characterize Grant Holloway and found she didn't have an efficient description. "A security consultant I brought on. He's good at this." "Good at what specifically? Seeing things." She paused. "He stood up for me in a cafe when Rourke confronted me publicly. Who I was, She stopped. "He just wasn't willing to sit there and let it happen." Sienna was quiet for a moment. "Huh. What? Nothing. You just sound different when you talk about him." "I sound different because I'm describing a professional relationship, but in which I actually feel someone is paying attention." Sienna. "I'm not saying anything. You're saying something with your silence." "I'm saying," Sienna said carefully, "that in 11 years of knowing you, I've never once heard you describe a person as good at seeing things like it's the most important quality anyone could possibly have. That's interesting to me." Celeste looked out the window. A light changed. People crossed the street below, with umbrellas angled into the wind. "He has a daughter. 8 years hid her alone." "Okay," Sienna said, a single word but full. "He said the child would always come first. Before work, before anything I might need from him, before anything." He said it like he was stating a policy. She paused. "Most people say things like that, and then negotiate around them the first time it's inconvenient." He said it like it was simply true. Not even a decision he'd made. Just a fact. "What? You like him?" "I don't know him." "You're describing him like you've known him for years." She didn't answer right away. The car turned onto her block. Her building was ahead, the doorman visible through the rain. 14 years of her life were contained in that building, the early drafts of what became Arden Nexus, the late nights, the failures she hadn't told anyone about, the very specific loneliness of building something so large that it eventually became a reason for people to stay close without actually being close. "I like how honest he is," she said finally. "He doesn't perform. He doesn't manage my perception of him. He just says what he sees. That's called liking someone. Good night, Sienna. Call me when." She hung up, smiled despite herself, and stepped into the rain. Grant picked Lily up from school on Friday at 3:15, which was early enough that the time before dinner to stop at the park, even with the weather being what it had been. Lily was 8 years old, and of the view that rain was not a real obstacle to anything, which was either a character trait or a consequence of growing up in Seattle. Grant had long since stopped arguing either direction. She ran ahead of him on the wet path, her yellow rain boots making satisfying splashes in puddles she aimed for deliberately. "Yeah. Is your work going okay?" He caught up with her near the duck pond, where there were currently no ducks, presumably because even the ducks had more sense than to be out in this. "Why? You look like you're thinking about something even when you're not doing anything." She said it with the direct simplicity of children who haven't yet learned that pointing out these things is considered impolite. "Like right now. You're looking at the water, but you're not actually seeing the water." He looked at her. She was right, which was annoying in the way that being correctly observed by an 8-year-old was always a little annoying. "I'm working on something complicated." "What kind of complicated?" "Figuring out who's been hurting a person's business." Behind the scenes, Lily considered this. Like a spy? More like a detective. She seemed satisfied with this. She jumped over a puddle, landed in another one instead. Didn't seem bothered. Is it the lady from your phone the other night? He'd been on the phone with Celeste 3 times that week, once past 11. And he kept his voice low, but apparently not low enough. You weren't supposed to hear that. I wasn't trying to hear it. You just have a different voice when you're talking to her. He stopped walking. What does that mean? Lily turned around and looked at him with an expression that was unsettlingly close to the one his grandmother used to give him when she thought he was being deliberately obtuse. You sound more awake, she said simply, and then she ran ahead toward the path exit, yellow boots flashing. He stood in the rain at the edge of the duck pond for a moment. He sounded more awake. He made a mental note to have a conversation with his daughter about the difference between observation and commentary, and then he made a second mental note that she was probably right. Then he followed her back to the car because they were both soaked, and he still had to figure out dinner. The city hummed around them, ordinary and indifferent, and somewhere across it, Celeste Arden was sit at desk reading Warren Pike's communication records. And somewhere across it, Gideon Rourke was making phone calls that would, very soon, stop having the effect he intended. None of them knew that last part yet. Grant turned the heat up in the car and listened to Lily talk about a disagreement she'd had at school about whether penguins could theoretically survive in Seattle. And he let the sound of her voice do the thing it always did, pull him fully into the actual present, the one that was right in front of him. He was good at reading rooms. His daughter had always been good at reading him. The communication records arrived on a Tuesday. Not all at once. That would have been too clean, too manageable. He'd intervened. They came in 3 separate batches across the course of a single morning, each one requiring a different authorization level to access, each one adding weight to something that was already getting heavy. Yes, he'd intervened. Grant sat at his desk on the 14th floor with 2 monitors running and a coffee that went cold before he was a quarter of the way through the first batch, and by noon he had stopped noticing the temperature of anything in the room. Warren Pike was meticulous. That was the first thing Grant understood, working through the records. Careless. Not arrogant, in the way that people who think they won't get caught tend to be arrogant. Warren had been careful in ways that suggested genuine intelligence, routing certain communications through personal devices, keeping his most sensitive exchanges outside the company's server ecosystem. Yes, he'd intervened, using a secondary email account registered to a shell advisory entity that was technically disclosed in that 18-month-old governance footnote and practically invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. The problem with being meticulous was that meticulousness left its own kind of trail. Because if you were careful, every single time, if you always used the secondary account for the sensitive material, if you always routed personal calls through a separate line, if you always maintained the same practice separation between your legitimate work communications and your illegitimate ones, then the pattern of your carefulness became its own evidence. The negative space of what wasn't in the official record pointed directly at what was in the unofficial one. Grant built the map over 4 days. He did it the way he'd once built operational surveillance assessments methodically, without rushing toward a conclusion, letting the data arrange itself instead of arranging it around what he suspected. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, years ago, in circumstances that were not relevant to a corporate boardroom, but whose discipline applied anyway. You saw what was there, not what you expected to find. You let the picture develop. Developed was this. Warren Pike had been in contact with a financial intermediary named Douglas Reeve, who operated through a consulting entity called Centaur Group at least 64 times over the prior 14 months. The contact was distributed across phone records, calendar entries marked as personal, and a pattern of encrypted messaging app usage that showed up as metadata anomalies in the company's device management logs, not the content of the messages, which were unrecoverable, but the timing and frequency of connections to a specific server address that Grant traced back to a commercial encrypted messaging platform, commonly used in financial circles. Douglas Reeve, when Grant pulled his background, was 3 degrees of separation from Rourke Capital Holdings. He sat on the advisory board of a real estate investment trust that shared 2 institutional investors with a Rourke-affiliated fund. He had co-authored a white paper on technology sector acquisitions with a managing director at Rourke Capital 7 years ago. He attended the same annual conference in Scottsdale that Gideon Rourke attended every February without fail. These were not proof of a conspiracy. In isolation, not one of these things meant anything. Together, over 14 months, aligned with the timeline Grant had already constructed of Rourke's external moves and Arden Nexus's internal decisions, they meant everything. On the fourth day, Grant found the payment. It was buried in a consulting fee structure that Warren had established 18 months ago through a legitimate-looking advisory arrangement. Centaur Group had paid Warren's personal consulting entity, a small LLC registered in Delaware, under the name WP Strategic Advisors, a total of $237,000 across 7 payments, each just below the threshold that triggered automatic enhanced reporting requirements. The payments were labeled as strategic consulting fees. The dates of the payments corresponded within 2 to 3 weeks each time, with the dates of Arden Nexus's most significant internal strategic decisions: the Meridian Acquisition Identification, Regulatory Risk Assessment, the Investor Communication Strategy Review. The payments weren't for consulting. They were receipts. Grant sat back in his chair and looked at what he'd built on the screen in front of him, and he felt the particular cold clarity that came at the end of a long surveillance operation when the picture finally resolves. It wasn't satisfaction. It was never really satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling of watching something inevitable arrive. He called Celeste at 4:30. "I need to see you," he said. Not on the phone. She heard something in his voice. "How soon?" "Tomorrow morning, early. Before Warren gets in." A pause. "That bad?" "Come in at 6:30. I'll have everything laid out." She was there at 6:15. He had the 2 monitors arranged so she could see both from the chair he'd pulled around to his side of the desk, and he walked her through it in the order he'd assembled it, jumping to the conclusion, but building toward it the way the evidence actually built, so that by the time she arrived at Warren's name, there was no other direction the path could have gone. She didn't say anything for a long time when he finished. The office was quiet. The building had a particular quality of silence. At this hour, the HVAC running, a distant elevator somewhere, the specific absence of the 437 people who would fill these floors in 2 more hours. $237,000, she said, across 7 payments. The structure suggests someone set it up who understood the reporting thresholds. Warren would understand the reporting thresholds. Her voice was very controlled. He sat in on every compliance review we've done for 6 years. Yes, she stood up and walked to the window. His office faced east, and the early light was coming in thin and pale, the sky, the color of old pewter with a strip of pale orange at the horizon. He watched her stand there, with her arms crossed, not a defensive posture, more like she was physically holding herself together, and he thought about what she'd said in her own office 2 weeks ago. 8 years. He was my 3rd hire. He brought coffee to board presentations. He sat across from me in a meeting 3 days ago, she said. Strategy review. He told me we were handling the Hargrove situation well. He told me the board was stabilizing. She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that was worse than tears, the specific quality of someone who has just had a load-bearing belief removed. He looked right at me and said those things. People who do this for a while learn how to compartmentalize it. It doesn't make it better. Grant agreed. It really doesn't. She came back to the desk and looked at the monitor again, at the payment schedule, at the timeline alignment, at the 64 contacts with Douglas Reeve. Is this enough? She said. Legally, is this enough? For a board presentation? Yes. For criminal prosecution, you'd need the content of the encrypted messages, and that's harder to recover, possibly impossible, without a court order. But for removal, for a full board response, for cooperating with regulators, this is more than enough. He paused. The question is how you use it. She looked at him. If you confront Warren directly, he has time to respond, to shape his narrative, to reach out to whoever he needs to reach out to before the board convenes. If Rourke learns the investigation has reached this point before you're ready to move, Teza, a window where countermoves become possible. He pulled a printed summary from the folder beside his keyboard. The way this works best is if Warren doesn't know, you know. Not until everyone who needs to be in the room is already in the room. She took the summary from him. Read it standing up. An emergency board session. Full board. No pre-notice to Warren. Pre-notice to the two directors with Rourke-adjacent relationships. I have flags on both of them as well. Nothing as solid as Warren's, but enough to warrant keeping them out of any advanced communication. If I call an emergency session without notifying the COO, that is itself a signal. Warren will know something is happening. By the time he knows, it needs to already be happening. He met her eyes. You'd have to move fast. Call the session for the earliest possible date. Get your documentation packaged and ready to present before anyone who isn't fully trusted gets a chance to ask questions. She looked at the summary in her hand, at the two monitors, at the 14 months of reconstructed damage laid out in organized columns on a screen in a small office on the 14th floor of the company she'd built from nothing. Okay, she said, just that. No dramatic statement. Visible collapse. Just the word quiet and certain. He respected that more than he would have respected almost any other response. The board session was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 a.m. Getting it organized without triggering premature awareness in the wrong people required a level of operational precision that Celeste executed with a steadiness that Grant found professionally impressive. She worked through Marcus Vail and through the two board members she trusted most completely, Adrian Cho, a former federal judge who had joined the board 3 years ago and whose legal instincts were formidable, and Robert Tanaka, who had co-founded 2 technology companies before Arden Nexus and who had the particular useful quality of appearing utterly unperturbed by things that were actually alarming. The session was framed as an emergency governance review. The notice language was careful. It conveyed urgency without specific subject matter, which was legally permissible and practically important. Every board member received it simultaneously through the official board notification system. There was no pre-call, no individual warning, no corridor conversation. Warren Pike received the same notice as everyone else. Grant watched the building's access records on Wednesday and saw Warren enter at his usual time, move through his usual routine, take lunch at his desk. Nothing in his behavior suggested he'd been tipped. The encrypted messaging app showed no unusual connection activity. He was walking into Thursday, not knowing what was waiting. On Wednesday evening, Grant was at his kitchen table, helping Lily with a project about the water cycle, when his phone showed a message from Celeste. Just 3 words, "Documents are ready." He typed back, "Get some sleep." Her response took a few minutes. He'd already gone back to Lily's diagram of evaporation and cloud formation, correcting a label she'd spelled wrong when the phone lit up again. Her message said, "I keep thinking about something you told me, that the pattern of Warren's carefulness was its own evidence. Trying too hard to hide something leaves its own kind of mark." He looked at the message. Typed, "Yeah." She wrote, "I think that's true about a lot of things. Just evidence." He wasn't sure what to do with that. He set the phone face down and listened to Lily explain, with considerable authority, why clouds were essentially just water that had changed its mind about being on the ground, and he thought that she was not wrong about that. He thought about Celeste's message for longer than was probably efficient. Thursday arrived the way important days tend to, with the same unremarkable morning routine surrounding it, the alarm, the coffee, the ordinary sequence of a day that didn't yet know what it was going to become. Grant dropped Lily at school at 7:55, which meant he arrived at Arden Nexus at 8:22, which was 8 minutes before the board session was scheduled to begin. He did not attend the board session. He was not a board member and did not need to be in the room. His job had been to build the case and hand it to Celeste. What she did with it in that room was hers. He sat in his office on the 14th floor with a fresh coffee and the access monitoring system open on one screen, watching the building's security data in real time. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for exactly. Just the particular alertness of someone who has put something in motion and is listening for whether it goes the direction it's supposed to go. The board session was scheduled for 90 minutes. It ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He knew it had gone the way it needed to go when Adrian Cho appeared in his office doorway at 11:15 with the composed expression of someone who had just done something difficult correctly. She was 73 years old. She was 73 years old and had the posture of a woman, who had spent decades in courtrooms, and she looked at Grant with a kind of professional acknowledgement that communicated a great deal without requiring many words. The board has voted to remove Warren Pike from his position effective immediately, pending a formal compliance litigation, she said. Security is with him now. He's being escorted to his office to retrieve personal belongings under supervision. How did he take the presentation? He denied everything for approximately 40 minutes. She paused, the ghost of something that wasn't quite satisfaction crossing her face. Celeste asked him to explain a specific payment date, alignment, and he stopped talking. People always stop talking eventually. In my experience, she said, the smart ones stop sooner. Warren stopped at about the right time to suggest he's thinking about cooperation. Grant nodded. The two directors? Removed from the relevant committees pending review. They didn't fight it. I think they understood that fighting was no longer in their interest. She straightened. The board has also voted to authorize Celeste to proceed with the Meridian acquisition on her original timeline. Unanimously, including the two members who abstained on everything for the past 6 months. He looked at that for a moment. Unanimously. Unanimously, she turned to go, then paused. You did good work, Mr. Holloway. She did the work. Adrian Cho looked at him with the particular precision of a former federal judge who had spent her career distinguishing between technical truth and actual truth. She presented the evidence. You built. Both things are true. She left. Grant turned back to his monitor. He found Celeste 45 minutes later in a small conference room on the 22nd floor, alone, sitting at a table with a legal pad in front of her and a pen she wasn't using. She'd taken her jacket off. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. She looked like someone who had just run a very long race and hadn't yet decided whether to sit down or keep moving. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. Hey. He came in, sat down across from her. The legal pad had 2 words on it. He could see from his angle. Written at the top, in her handwriting. Next steps. Below that, nothing yet. Adrian told me, he said. It went, she stopped. Tried again. I've done a lot of hard things in this company. I fired our first VP of engineering. I turned down an acquisition offer that would have made me personally wealthy enough to never work again, because I believed we could build something worth more than the check. I've sat in rooms with investors who told me I was too young, too inexperienced, too everything. She looked at the blank legal pad. I've never done anything that felt like that. Like what? Like removing a person I loved from a job I gave him. Looking at him across a conference table and presenting evidence of what he'd done and watching him. She pressed her lips together briefly. He looked surprised. I know that sounds strange, given everything, but he looked genuinely surprised that I had it. Like he'd been doing it for so long and so carefully that some part of him had stopped believing anyone would ever find it. People get comfortable, he cried, she said, for about 2 minutes near the end. Before he stopped talking, she paused. I don't know what to do with that. If it was real or strategic or both. Probably both, Grant said honestly. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at him for a moment. You're not going to tell me to not feel bad about it. Why would I tell you that? Most people would. Most people would say he made his choices, he did this to himself. You don't owe him your empathy. All of which is factually true. Factually true things aren't always the most useful things. He leaned back in the chair. You spent 8 years trusting someone who was spending at least 14 months of that time betraying you. You're allowed to feel whatever that actually feels like, which is probably not one specific thing. She exhaled slowly. It's about 6 things simultaneously. Sounds about right. She picked up the pen. Set it down again. Gideon doesn't know yet. He'll know by the end of the day. The board action isn't public, but Warren will make contact. That's almost certain. What do you think he does? Grant considered this carefully. He thought about the man in the cafe, the deliberate spill of the coffee, the boredom in his face, the legal filings designed to drain rather than win, the 14 months of patient, methodical campaign to weaken a company from the inside before moving on it from the outside. He's been executing a plan, Grant said. The plan assumed you didn't know. You do, and the internal piece has been exposed. His leverage just changed. Does that make him more dangerous or less? Unpredictable people who've lost a controlled advantage are always more dangerous in the short term. He met her eyes. The long game just shifted in your direction. He was building a wall around you, piece by piece. You just took out a load-bearing section. She wrote something on the legal pad. He couldn't see what. There's going to be fallout. Warren's removal, even if we manage the communications carefully, will generate questions. The financial press will speculate. Some of our investors will panic before they calm down. You should get ahead of the investor communication today. A full explanation, you can't give a full explanation while there's an active compliance investigation, but enough to signal that this was a proactive governance action, not a crisis response. She nodded. She was already writing. He watched her shift from the weight of the morning's emotional reality into the operational mode that was clearly her natural habitat when things needed doing. It happened the way a tide turns, not a dramatic switch, just the water moving in a different direction. Yeah, thank you. She said it simply, without the layered professional formality of 2 weeks ago, like she was just saying it to a person. He nodded. You're welcome. By Friday afternoon, Gideon Rourke knew. Grant was certain of this, because the legal pressure changed texture. Rourke's attorneys filed a motion to expedite the assault complaint timeline, which was a move that made no strategic sense unless you were trying to create noise in response to news you hadn't expected. The expedited filing would fail. Marcus Vail had already told him so with the calm certainty of someone reading a weather forecast, but the action itself was communicative. It said, I know something changed, and I'm responding, and you should know I'm responding. Grant let Marcus handle the legal response and focused on the next layer of the problem, because Rourke wasn't done. A man like Gideon Rourke, Grant understood from 11 years of watching how threat actors behave when their primary approach fails, did not simply absorb a setback and reassess. He escalated. He shifted tactics. He looked for a different angle of pressure. The question was which angle. Grant had 3 working hypotheses. The first was regulatory. Rourke might find a way to supplement the existing FTC complaint or add a new filing through a different channel. The second was financial. He might attempt to accelerate the pressure on Hargrove Capital or find another institutional investor to move against Celeste's position. The third was personal, and this was the one Grant weighted most heavily because it aligned with the pattern he'd observed in the cafe. Gideon Rourke's method was humiliation, public discrediting, making the target feel exposed and small. He brought all 3 hypotheses to Celeste on Friday evening, sitting in her office at 6 p.m., while the last of the day's staff filtered out of the building. She listened without interrupting, which he'd come to recognize as her mode of serious attention. When she interrupted, it meant she already had a response and was waiting for the right moment. When she was silent, it meant she was actually processing. Personal, she said when he finished. You think he goes personal? He came to a cafe to humiliate you in front of strangers. He didn't have to do that. The information he had could have been used in a dozen more efficient ways. He chose the public demonstration. Grant crossed one ankle over his knee. That's not strategy. That's preference. She thought about this. Outside the window, the city was in its early evening mode, the light changing, the traffic shifting, the particular urban energy of a day winding down. He said something in the cafe, she said slowly. Before you stood up, he said I was too emotional about the company to see it clearly. That sentiment had clouded my judgment. She paused. He said it like it was an observation, like he was being helpful. That's what they do. They deliver the knife as a favor. If he goes personal, what does that look like? What's he actually going to attack? Competence. Your decision-making. Grant paused. Possibly your personal life. Anything that can be used to suggest you're not fit to lead the company. She was quiet for a moment. I don't have much of a personal life for him to use. You have me, Grant said, and then heard how that sounded. As a professional relationship that he'll try to mischaracterize. He'll use the fact that you hired someone who had an altercation with his security guard. He'll frame it as erratic judgment. Surrounding yourself with people involved in legal disputes. She looked at him steadily. Is that what you are? Someone involved in a legal dispute? From his perspective. From your perspective. He met her eyes. From my perspective, I'm someone trying to make sure a careful, intelligent woman doesn't lose something she built because a bored rich man decided she was a convenient target. He said it without particular emphasis. Just the fact of it. She held his gaze for a moment in a way that made him feel more seen than he usually allowed. What Lily told me, she said, when she met me in the parking lot that one time, when I was dropping off the files. He frowned slightly. Lily had met Celeste once, briefly, when Celeste had stopped by his car in the Arden Nexus parking garage to hand off documents rather than send them through the building system. He'd had Lily in the back seat, and the interaction had lasted maybe 4 minutes. What did she say? She said Celeste smiled, and it was the kind of smile that was slightly surprised by itself, like it arrived before she'd decided to let it. She said, "Are you the lady my dad's helping?" And I said, "Yes." And she thought about it for a second, and then she said, "He's really good at helping people. He doesn't always know when to let people help him back." Grant stared at her. She's 8. She's 8, and she's apparently a very observant 8. Celeste leaned forward, elbows on her desk. "She's not wrong, is she?" He didn't answer immediately. He thought about the duck pond in the rain. About you sound more awake. About an 8-year-old who read him more accurately than most adults he'd known for years. "She's usually not wrong about much," he said. "Grant, I want to be clear about something." Her voice was careful but direct, the voice she used in boardrooms when she was committing to a position. "What we're doing here is professional. What you've done for this company for me is professional. I'm not confused about that." She paused. "But I'm also not going to pretend that I don't," she stopped. "This hasn't become something different from how it started." The office was very quiet. "Different how?" he said. "I look forward to seeing you," she said. "Not to the information you bring, to the progress on the investigation. To you, specifically. I notice when you're not in the building. I notice when you're tired. I notice when you're thinking about Lily, because your whole expression changes and you think it doesn't, but it does." She held his gaze. "I don't do this. I don't say things like this to people I work with. I'm not built for this kind of conversation. But you told me on day one to take what you tell me seriously, and I think that has to go both ways." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about all the ways this was complicated. About Lily, who came first always, and whose world was the thing he protected most carefully. About the investigation still in progress. About the professional structure of the past 2 weeks. About the ways that what she'd just said was a complication he hadn't fully prepared for. And then he thought about sitting at a cafe table 3 weeks ago with a paperback he'd been rereading for the 4th time because he hadn't found much that was new in a while. Yes, he'd intervened, and how something had shifted in the room the moment he'd looked up and seen a woman defending her coffee-soaked documents with her hands shaking and her back completely straight. "I'm not built for fast," he said. "I know that. I move slowly when something actually matters. It's not distance. It's just how I'm wired. Asking you to move fast." She held his gaze. "Just telling you the truth. Because I think you'd rather know the truth than not know it." He thought about that. She was right. He always preferred to know. "Okay," he said. She blinked. "Okay, I hear you." He stood up, not retreating, just moving, because sitting still at this particular moment felt like the wrong thing to do. He went to the window. The city was darker now, the lights coming on across the skyline, the sound visible in the distance as a flat gray line. "Lily likes you," he said. "She doesn't like most people. She tolerates them. She's polite to them. But she liked you in 4 minutes in a parking garage, and Lily's read on people is the most reliable data point I have." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I'm being evaluated by an 8-year-old. You passed. Good to know." He turned around. "There's still work to do. Rourke's not finished, and I don't want to be distracted from that. Asking you to be distracted, I know." He met her eyes. "I just want to say it out loud. So we both know where the line is. We finish this first. We finish this first." It wasn't a romantic agreement. It wasn't a promise of anything specific. It was just 2 people who were both honest enough to say the true thing and careful enough to not let it capsize something that still needed to sail. He picked up his folder from the desk. "Get to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be complicated." She was already writing on the legal pad. It was already complicated. He left her office, took the elevator to the 14th floor, retrieved his jacket and his phone, and walked through the quiet building toward the parking garage. His car was on level 3. He sat in it for a moment without starting the engine. He thought about his daughter, telling a woman she'd met for 4 minutes, that he was good at helping people, but didn't always know when to let people help him back. He'd intervened. He thought about how the most accurate people in his life had always been the ones who watched without needing to make it about themselves. He started the car. He had a daughter to get home to. Case that wasn't finished. A man named Gideon Rourke, who was somewhere in this city, recalibrating, looking for a new angle because men like that didn't stop. But somewhere in this accounting of everything that was true right now, there was also this. A woman on the 22nd floor who had said the honest thing because she thought he'd rather know. She was right, he had always rather known. He pulled out of the parking garage into the dark, rain-wet Seattle night, and he drove home. Gideon Rourke moved faster than Grant expected, not in the direction Grant had predicted, which was the part that bothered him. Grant had mapped 3 likely vectors of attack and weighted them in order of probability. He'd been wrong about the sequence, not about the intention. The intention was exactly what he'd said to Celeste on Friday evening, personal and public, and designed to humiliate, but about the method. He found out about it on a Monday morning, 8 days after the board session, when Dana Park called him at 7:41 while he was in the school drop-off line. "There's a piece," she said. Her voice had the particular compressed quality of someone delivering bad news efficiently. A financial news outlet. It went up 40 minutes ago. Which outlet? Capital Current. They have a readership of about 200,000. Institutional investors, fund managers, corporate governance people. A pause. "It's about you." Lily was getting out of the car. She turned back and waved at him through the window with the particular energy of a child who had somewhere to be. He waved back, watched her disappear through the school's front door. What does it say? It says, Celeste Arden has hired a controversial private security consultant with a history of legal disputes to conduct unauthorized surveillance of Arden Nexus board members and employees. It says you have an ongoing assault complaint filed against you by Rourke Capital Holdings. It says, Dana's voice tightened slightly. It quotes an anonymous source described as a senior Arden Nexus executive who says that Ms. Arden's judgment has become erratic and that her personal attachment to her securities consultant has compromised her professional decision-making. The drop-off line moved. Grant pulled forward automatically. Senior executive. Someone who either is or is pretending to be. Warren, it didn't require analysis. Yes. Warren Pike, who had been removed 9 days ago and who was currently under a compliance investigation, had either spoken directly to a Capital Current journalist or had spoken to someone who had. The timing was too precise, the framing too specific. The phrase personal attachment was doing exactly the work Gideon had designed it. To do it was simultaneously vague enough to be unprovable and specific enough to be damaging. Does Celeste know? She's the one who told me to call you. She's in her office. He was already pulling onto the main road. I'll be there in 15 minutes. She was standing at her window when he came in, which he'd learned was where she went when she was thinking. Rather than reacting, the window was where Celeste processed. The desk was where she acted. He closed the door behind him. I've read it, he said. She turned around. She looked tired in a way that was different from the operational tiredness of long weeks into early mornings. This was the specific exhaustion of someone who had been hit, somewhere they'd thought was protected. The personal attachment line. Yes, it came from Warren. Almost certainly. Or through Warren to someone Rourke's team positioned as the source. The distinction matters legally, but not practically. She pressed her lips together. What it does, functionally, is give every investor who was already uncertain a reason to frame their uncertainty around my judgment rather than the company's fundamentals. It's not about whether it's true. It's about whether it becomes the story people tell. She turned back to the window. I've spent 14 years making sure the story people tell about Arden Nexus is about the product, the growth, the vision. About me personally. Not about, she stopped. Not about who you spend time with. It's designed to make you collateral damage, she said. The piece is really about me. You're the instrument. If I'm seen as a CEO who hired a legally controversial figure because of personal reasons, then everything I've done in the last 3 weeks, the board session, the Warren removal, the acquisition push, all of it gets reframed as emotion-driven chaos. Strategy. No. Leadership. She turned around, and you get to be the person who destabilized a billion-dollar company because you stood up in a cafe. I can handle the piece. You shouldn't have to handle the piece. Her voice had an edge now, not at him, just the friction of someone grinding against something that wasn't fair. You did everything right. You built the case meticulously. You never once overstepped. And now your name is in a financial news article with the word controversial attached to it and an assault complaint that you didn't deserve. Celeste. She stopped. I knew this was a possibility when I took the job. He said it evenly. Rourke was always going to come at whatever was adjacent to you. Was predictable. This he nodded at her desk, where the article was pulled up on her tablet. This is just him being thorough. Thorough, she repeated. That's the word you're using. It's a word that doesn't make me angrier than is useful. He sat down. Anger that's not useful is expensive. We need to think about the response. She looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was complicated frustration and something softer underneath it, the same quality he'd noticed in the parking garage conversation about Lily's comment. She sat down across from him and became visibly the CEO. The shift was something he'd watched enough times now to recognize. A small adjustment of posture, a clearing of whatever she'd just been feeling into a category labeled later. Marcus's instinct is to issue a statement, she said. Factual correction of the assault complaint characterization. Our position is that the complaint is without merit, pending dismissal, filed in bad faith. That's correct but insufficient. He leaned forward. The article's power isn't in the legal characterization. It's in the personal attachment framing. If we respond to the legal piece and ignore the personal piece becomes the thing everyone remembers. And if we address the personal piece, we validate that there's something to address. He paused. There's a third option. She waited. You give an interview. A written statement interview. A written statement interview whose readership overlaps with Capital Currents, but who has a different editorial orientation. You talk about the board session, the Warren removal, the acquisition. You talk about the governance process. You make the story about the company's structural strength, not the personal attack. And you mention my role, precisely security and strategic risk consultant, retained on standard professional terms, whose work led directly to the identification and removal of the source of the information leak. He met her eyes. You don't defend me. You contextualize me. There's a difference. She thought about this. You think an interview works better than a statement. A statement is a wall. An interview is a door. Right now you want people to walk through something and come out the other side with a different picture than the one Rourke just painted. He paused. You're good on camera. You're better in conversation than in prepared text. Prepared text version of you sounds like a corporation. The real version of you sounds like someone who knows exactly what she built and why it matters. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile. You've thought about this. I've been in the car for 15 minutes. That's fast. Old habit. He stood up. Call the journalist first. Let Marcus write the statement before you've decided whether to do the interview. Because once the statement is out, the interview becomes defensive rather than proactive. She was already reaching for her phone. Then she stopped. Grant. Yeah, for what it's worth, the personal attachment thing. She looked at him steadily. I'm not embarrassed by it. I want you to know that. I'm angry that he's using it as a weapon, not because it points at something I'm ashamed of. He held her gaze for a moment. I know, he said. He went back to the 14th floor and spent the morning doing two things simultaneously, tracking the article's spread through financial media channels and building a detailed response document for Marcus that mapped every factually false claim in the Capital Current piece, against verifiable corrective evidence. It was careful, methodical work, the kind that required him to set aside the part of him that wanted to find Douglas Reeves' business address and have an entirely different conversation. He didn't do that. He wrote the document. By noon, Celeste had confirmed an interview with a journalist named Patricia Sohn at a publication called Meridian Review, a financial and governance-focused outlet with a readership that skewed toward institutional investors and board-level executives. The interview was set for Wednesday afternoon. In the meantime, Marcus issued a narrow factual correction on the assault complaint characterization, attributed to company legal counsel, which addressed nothing emotional and corrected two specific misrepresentations. The story continued circulating. Grant watched the engagement metrics on the Capital Current piece and noted that it was being shared primarily by accounts with demonstrated connections to Rourke Capital Holdings' institutional network. Coordinated amplification, not organic spread. He documented everything. The interview ran on Thursday morning. Patricia Sohn was 61 years old and had been covering corporate governance for 32 years, and her interview style was the kind that all looked relaxed and moved like a scalpel. She let Celeste talk, which was the right instinct because Celeste talking without interruption was considerably more compelling than Celeste answering pointed questions. She described the governance process that had led to Warren's removal with precise, unemotional language. She described the acquisition timeline and its strategic rationale. She addressed the regulatory inquiry briefly and factually, open, being addressed fully, expected to close without action, and moved past it without dwelling. When Patricia asked about Grant, Celeste said, "I retained a security and strategic risk consultant to help identify the source of an information leak that had been affecting our company for over a year. He identified it. He documented it. His work led directly to a board action that has significantly strengthened Arden Nexus's governance structure. The characterization of that professional relationship in recent coverage was inaccurate and appears to have originated from a source with a clear interest in destabilizing this company." Patricia asked, "Capital Current described the relationship as personal in nature." Celeste said, "Capital Current described it using an anonymous source. I've described it using facts." A pause. "I'll also say this, I've worked in this industry for 14 years. In my experience, when a woman in a leadership position builds a working relationship with anyone, the relational nature of that relationship gets scrutinized in ways it simply doesn't for male executives. I'm not making a political statement. I'm observing a pattern." She didn't overplay it. She said it once and moved on. Grant read the interview transcript at 6 a.m. Thursday, sitting at his kitchen table while Lily ate cereal and tried to read over his shoulder. "What is that?" Lily asked. "An interview." "Who's it about?" "Celeste." Lily considered this while chewing. "Is it a good interview or a bad interview?" "It's a good one." "Does she say good things?" "Yeah." He set his phone down. "She says good things." Lily seemed satisfied. She went back to her cereal. "Can she come to my soccer game on Saturday?" He looked at his daughter. "My soccer game. Saturday." She said it with the patient repetition of a child who has concluded that adults process information slowly. She could come if she wanted. If she doesn't have work. "I'm just saying she could." She put her spoon down with the particular finality of a topic being deposited rather than dropped. "You don't have to make it a big deal, Dad." He looked at his 8-year-old, who was apparently managing his social calendar in addition to her own, and thought about saying several things, none of which seemed adequate. "I'll think about it," he said. "That means yes," Lily said, and carried her bowl to the sink. The Meridian Review interview shifted the narrative. Immediately, these things never moved immediately, but over the following 4 days, yet he did impede. Grant watched the concurrent piece lose momentum in the financial media ecosystem, while Celeste's interview gained traction in the governance and institutional investor community. 2 board members of companies he didn't recognize sent Celeste written notes of support. One of Hargrove Capital's senior analysts published a short commentary piece suggesting that the Capital Current reporting had raised more questions about its sourcing than about Arden Nexus's leadership. It wasn't victory. It was the tide moving. On Friday afternoon, Marcus Vail called Grant directly, which he hadn't done before, and said, in his characteristic understated way, "The assault complaint against you. I've been reviewing the filing in detail. There are 3 procedural deficiencies that make it vulnerable to a motion to dismiss. I'd like to file that motion next week if you're amenable." "File it," Grant said. "I'll need a brief information session with you Monday. Perhaps. Also." A pause. Marcus Vail pauses were different from other people's. Pauses, they felt intentional, like he was choosing his next words, the way a watchmaker chose components. "The sourcing on the Capital Current piece. We've been tracking it. The original tip appears to have gone through a PR firm. with documented relationships with Rourke Capital. We're building a record of that connection. For what purpose? At present, documentation. Another precise pause. At a future point, potentially, as part of a broader legal action regarding the coordinated campaign against Arden Nexus. That's Celeste's decision, not mine. But I want the record to exist. Grant thought about the 64 contacts, the 7 payments, the 14 months. Make sure the record is complete, he said. That's my intention. He hung up and sat for a moment in his office on the 14th floor. Outside his window, Seattle was in its mid-afternoon gray, the light flat and even, the city going about its ordinary business below. Somewhere in this city, Gideon Rourke was reading the Meridian Review interview and recalculating. Somewhere in this city, Warren Pike was having conversations with compliance investigators and corporate attorneys, and deciding how far cooperation was worth going. Somewhere in this city, the Meridian acquisition was moving through its final due diligence stages, closer every day to the closing that Gideon had spent 14 months trying to prevent. Grant pulled up his notes and started drafting the final risk assessment update. He was methodical about it, documenting what had been resolved, what remained active, what required continued monitoring, regulatory inquiry, the assault complaint, the Hargrove Capital position, the 2 compromised board directors. He wrote for an hour. Then he sent Celeste a text. "Can you talk?" Her response came 30 seconds later. "Call me." "The Meridian deal," he said when she picked up. "Where does it stand?" "Final due diligence closes Tuesday. If nothing changes between now and then, we move to signing within 10 days. Her voice had a different quality than it had carried for the past several weeks, not relaxed. Exactly, but something closer to it, like a piece of machinery running at its intended load rather than above it. Legal is satisfied. The board authorization is in place. The acquisition team has been working around the clock. Rourke can't stop it now. No. A pause. He could try to create enough noise in the next 10 days to spook our capital structure. But the investors who matter have had direct conversations with me, with our CFO, with Adrian. They're not moving. She paused again. He lost his inside access. Without Warren feeding him the timing and the structural details, he's working blind. He's going to figure that out soon, if he hasn't already. He already has, she said, which is why the capital current piece was the move it was. He couldn't hit the company from inside anymore, so he tried to hit the company through the story around it. A beat. It didn't work. It didn't work, Grant agreed. Because of you. Because of the work, he said. There's a difference. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. You do that every time. Do what? Redirect credit away from yourself. You do it reflexively. You don't even notice. He didn't have a particular response to that. It was accurate. The remaining items on the risk assessment, he said. The assault complaint looks like it'll be dismissed on procedural grounds by end of next week. The regulatory inquiry, your legal team's response is solid. Reviewed it Thursday. I think it closes clean. He paused. The 2 board directors. What's the status there? They submitted formal resignations this morning. Both of them. Her voice was even. They gave governance reasons, which is a polite way of saying they read the situation and chose the exit that preserved the most dignity. And the Hargrove letter. I spoke with their senior partner personally on Wednesday, after the interview published. He said, and I'm going to quote him, because it's worth quoting. He said, we've seen leadership under pressure before. This is what it looks like when it's handled correctly. A pause. They're not moving. They're holding their 7%. Grant sat back in his chair. He thought about the Hargrove letter that had arrived while Celeste was eating cereal at 11:15 at night, about the word containment, recent developments, and the way institutional doubt had a specific, bloodless grammar. That's a significant shift. It is. She was quiet for a moment. Grant, something else. Yeah. Warren has agreed to full cooperation with the compliance investigation. His attorneys contacted Marcus this morning. He's going to provide communication records, contact logs, details of his arrangement with Centaura Group. She paused. He wants a reduced exposure recommendation in exchange. Is he going to get it? That's above my authority to promise him. But his cooperation is material. The information he has about the Rourke-Centaura relationship, the specific mechanics of how the leak operated that's useful to the regulators and potentially to a civil action. She exhaled slowly. I didn't want him to cooperate, if I'm being honest. I wanted him to just face what he did without getting anything for it. That's understandable, but it's not useful, he agreed. So I'm choosing useful. A pause. It's not the same as forgiving him. He's asking it to be. The silence that followed was the comfortable kind. The kind that had started appearing between them in the last week, not the cautious silences of the early professional relationship, where both of them were calibrating, but the easier kind that didn't require filling. Lily asked me something this morning, Grant said. He heard her posture change in the quality of her listening. What did she ask? Whether you could come to her soccer game Saturday. A pause, long enough that he wondered if he'd miscalculated. She asked that specifically? Verbatim. She said you could come if you wanted, if you didn't have work. He paused. She also said I didn't have to make it a big deal. Celeste made a sound not quite a laugh. Something warmer than that, like the laugh arrived before the circumstances quite warranted it, and she let it anyway. She sounds like someone I'd like to know better. She is someone worth knowing. He hesitated. Then, it's at 10, at the Eastview Community Field. It'll be cold, and there will be other 8-year-olds running in the wrong direction. That sounds genuinely appealing, she said, and he believed her. All right then. All right. Saturday was cold but dry for the first time in what felt like weeks. Celeste arrived at 9:52 with 2 cups of coffee, Grant's black, which she'd somehow already known, and Lily spotted her from the field before the warm-up was finished and waved with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who hadn't yet learned to ration her excitement. Grant was standing at the sideline when Celeste reached him. She handed him the cup. Their fingers touched briefly around the cardboard. Neither of them commented on it. She's fast, Celeste said, watching Lily sprint across the field in the wrong direction, which turned out to be the right direction after all, depending on how you read the play. She's terrifyingly fast, Grant said. She gets it from her mother. He said it without looking at her, watching the field, and Celeste absorbed the information the way she absorbed difficult things, without pressing, without making it more than he'd offered. It was fast too, was said, after a moment. State champion. 800 meters. He took a drink of the coffee. She would have loved watching Lily play. The sentence held everything it held, and neither of them tried to excavate it. The sun was thin but present, a pale disk behind the cloud cover that wasn't quite warming the air, but was at least trying. Around them, other parents gathered in small clusters. A coach shouted something encouraging and incomprehensible, and 8-year-olds began the inexact science of organized soccer. Lily scored a goal in the 22nd minute. She turned immediately to the sideline, found Grant first, then found Celeste beside him, and pointed at them both with the decisive joy of someone sharing credit. Celeste felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a ready category for. She'd built a billion-dollar company. She'd closed deals that moved markets. She'd sat in rooms with some of the most powerful financial minds in the country and held her ground. She had, in the past 6 weeks, survived a coordinated campaign by a man with significant resources and no apparent limit to his willingness to cause harm, and she had come through it with her company intact, and her position confirmed, and the man responsible for the campaign watching his own infrastructure begin to crack. Yes, he intervened. None of that had ever produced what a pointing 8-year-old on a muddy soccer field produced in her chest right now. You good? Grant said quietly beside her. Yeah, she said. Really good, actually. He looked at her for a moment with that same quality of attention, the direct, unhurried kind, that never felt like examination, just presence. Then he looked back at the field. She's going to want pancakes after, he said. I assumed. You, Grant. She looked at him. I want to. He nodded once. Not a performance of acceptance. Just the fact of it, which was she had come to understand exactly how he moved through most things. Plainly, without ceremony. They watched the rest of the game. The team won 3-2, which produced a celebration on the field that was completely disproportionate to the stakes of recreational under-9 soccer, and was therefore exactly correct. The Meridian acquisition closed on a Thursday, 11 days after the board had voted to authorize it, 9 days after the Capital Current piece had tried to make the case that the CEO had lost her judgment, 6 days after 2 compromised directors had submitted their resignations, and 5 days after Warren Pike's attorneys had delivered the first round of cooperation documents to to the compliance investigators. Then Celeste signed the final paperwork at 2:17 in the afternoon in a conference room on the 22nd floor with her legal team, her CFO and Adrian Cho present. The board had confirmed the signing authorization that morning in a vote that was for the first time in longer than Celeste wanted to calculate entirely unanimous. Grant was not in the room. He was on the 14th floor, finishing the last section of his risk assessment update when Dana Park appeared in his doorway and said simply, "It's done." He looked up from his screen. "All parties signed?" 2:17, she said. "Celeste asked me to tell you." Looked back at his screen. Typed 2 more lines of the assessment. Then he leaned back in his chair and let himself sit with the fact of it, from the full weight of what the past several weeks had been, and what the closed acquisition meant, and the particular satisfaction of a thing being finished been worth finishing, that it didn't go upstairs. Celeste would have people around her, her team, her board, the celebration that a moment like this warranted. He wasn't part of that architectures. That was fine. He had his own architecture. His phone buzzed at 3:45. A text from a number he didn't recognize, which immediately made him careful, because unknown numbers had taken on different significance in the past several weeks. The text said, "This is Gideon. I think we should talk." He stared at the message for a long moment. Then he forwarded it to Marcus Vale and typed, "Do not respond until Marcus has reviewed." His phone rang 14 seconds later. "Celeste." "You saw it," he said. "Marcus just sent it to me." Her voice was careful. "What do you think?" "I think a man who's watching his lawsuit fall apart, his primary information source, cooperating against him, and his target company, closing the acquisition he spent 14 months trying to prevent, I think that man is recalculating. He wants to negotiate, or he wants to establish communication for some other purpose. I don't know which yet." Grant stood up and walked to his window. The city below was in the gray gold of late afternoon, the light changing with that particular quality it had in Seattle. Yet when the cloud cover thinned just enough to let through something that wasn't quite sun. Respond to him directly. Let Marcus be the communication channel. Everything in writing, agreed. A pause. "The acquisition is closed, Grant. Sue's to meet him what he was trying for 14 months. It's done. It's real." He heard something in her voice that wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was closer to the feeling of getting back something that someone tried to take from you, not joyful, but deep. "You did that," he said. "We did that. You did the hard part." "The hard part," she said, "was not letting him make me doubt whether I was capable of it." That a pause. "I had some help with that part." The city moved below him. Somewhere across it, Gideon Rourke was sitting with a text message he hadn't received a response to. Somewhere across it, Warren Pike was in a room with investigators, spending the currencies of information that used to belong to someone else. Somewhere across it, the Meridian acquisition was now a closed fact that no amount of pressure or manipulation could unmake. "My assessment is almost done," Grant said. I'll have the final version to you by end of day tomorrow." A beat. "And after the assessment?" "After the assessment, you won't need a security consultant anymore." She was quiet for a moment. The silence had a specific texture, not absence. Something more deliberate than that. "I wasn't asking about the security consultant," she said. He thought about cold coffee in a cafe, about a child in yellow rain boots aiming at puddles, about a woman who said the honest thing because she figured he'd rather know. He said, "I'll call you tonight." "Okay." Yeah. He hung up and turned back to his desk. There was still work in front of him, the assessment to finish, the Gideon text to strategize around with Marcus, the remaining compliance documentation to review. The afternoon was not over. The work was not done. But something had shifted in the weight of the day, in a way he recognized from other moments in his life, not the relief of danger. Passing, which was its own distinct sensation, but something adjacent to it. The specific feeling of a thing that had been worth doing, turning out to have been worth doing. He sat back down and opened the assessment document. He finished it in 2 hours. Then he went to pick up Lily. Gideon Rourke's text message sat unanswered for 4 days. Was Marcus Vale's recommendation. And Grant agreed with it, not out of strategy for its own sake, but because a man who had spent 14 months in careful, methodical control of a situation was now reaching out through a personal device to a number he'd obtained through means that were themselves worth documenting. The reaching out was information. The desperation underneath it was information. You didn't rush to respond to information. You let it tell you everything it was going to tell you first. On the fifth day, Gideon's attorneys contacted Marcus formally. The message was structured as a litigation settlement inquiry. Rourke Capital Holdings was prepared to discuss withdrawal of the complaint against Grant Holloway and the associated claims against Arden Nexus in exchange for a mutual non-disclosure agreement covering the events of the past several months. Standard language, clean on the surface. Marcus read it to Grant over the phone in his characteristic measured cadence, and when he finished, there was a brief silence before Grant said, "He wants the NDA more than he wants the settlement." "That's my reading as well," Marcus said. "The complaint against you was always thin. It's going to be dismissed. The withdrawal costs him nothing. What he's buying with the withdrawal is silence. Silence about the coordination with Warren, Centera Group, about the regulatory filing. All of it." A pause. It's not an unreasonable offer from his perspective. The compliance investigation into Warren has been producing documentation that, if it becomes part of a civil action, creates significant exposure for Rourke's network. He wants to close that door before it opens further. What does Celeste want to do? That, Marcus said, is why I'm calling you before I call her. Grant sat with that for a moment. It was a question with layers. The NDA would end the legal pressure on him cleanly, immediately, without the drawn-out expense of dismissal proceedings and whatever followed. It would give Celeste a clean resolution she could communicate to her board and her investors. It would let everyone move forward without the ongoing weight of active litigation. It would also let Gideon Rourke move forward. "Tell me something," Grant said. "If we decline the NDA and the complaint gets dismissed on procedural grounds, which you said it will, happens to the broader exposure. The Centera connection, Warren's cooperation documents, the compliance investigation continues regardless of anti-civil agreement between private parties. Warren's cooperation is with regulators. That process doesn't stop because Rourke offers Celeste a settlement." Marcus paused. What an NDA would prevent is a private civil action, a lawsuit that Celeste could theoretically bring against Rourke for the coordinated campaign. That door closes permanently if she signs. And if she doesn't sign, that door stays open. Whether she walks through it is a separate question. Grant thought about a café on a gray Tuesday morning, about coffee spreading across acquisition documents, about the boredom on a man's face while a woman's hands shook. He thought about 14 months of payments to a man who'd brought coffee to board presentations, about a regulatory complaint filed in bad faith, about a Capital Current article designed to reframe a woman's competence as her personal failing. "Call Celeste," he said. "It's her company. It's her decision." "Of course." Another Marcus pause. "For what it's worth, Mr. Holloway, in my professional opinion, the decision she makes here will define the coda of this entire situation more than anything else that's happened." "Yeah," Grant said. "I think so too." Celeste called him that evening at 7:30, after Lily was in bed. He told her she could call late, and meant it. "He wants quiet," she said without preamble. She'd clearly been thinking since Smart called, which meant she'd already done most of the deciding. She was calling to say it out loud, he understood, not to ask permission. That's what the NDA is. He wants to buy quiet. Yes. And I'd get what? Legal resolution. A clean close. More complaint hanging over your name. She paused. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, he agreed. She let sit there. He walks away from 14 months of deliberate, coordinated harm to a company and the people in it. He restructures, he waits, and he finds someone else. Some other company with a CEO he decides is a convenient target. Some other CCOO he can find who's willing to sell out the people who trusted them. Her voice had a careful edge to it. Not anger, exactly. She'd moved past the hot anger weeks ago. This was the cooler, more durable version. I've been thinking about what this actually cost. Just me. The employees who'd have lost jobs if Arden Nexus went the way Rourke planned. The investors. The people at Meridian who'd been waiting 18 months for this acquisition to close. She paused. I'm not the only person he was willing to damage. You were just the most visible one. If I sign the NDA, the regulatory process continues, you said that. Warren's cooperation continues, but the civil option closes. Yes, and the civil option is the one where everything becomes a matter of public record. Court filings, discovery. Documentation that doesn't live in a compliance report, that 3 regulators read documentation that lives in a federal docket that anyone can access. He'd wondered if she'd get to that. He should have known she would. He said, "That's the distinction." "I'm not signing it," she said. He waited because there was clearly more. "I want it on record," she said. "All of it. The Centara payments, the timeline alignment, regulatory filing, what Warren did, and who paid him to do it, and how the whole machinery of it worked. I want it to exist somewhere permanent and accessible. Because," she stopped, "because the next person he does this to deserves to be able to find it." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window across the room, the city. At night, lights refracted through the glass, the steady low sound of the street below. "That's going to mean more legal process," he said. "More time. It won't be clean, I know. He'll fight it. He has resources and he'll use all of them." "I know that too," she paused. "Will you stay on?" "Through the civil process, as a consultant." He thought about the final risk assessment he'd delivered 2 days ago, about the professional structure that had been the frame around everything between them, about a woman on a 22nd floor saying, "I'm not asking you to move fast," and meaning it. "I'll stay on," he said. "A beat." "Okay. Get some sleep, Celeste." A pause that had warmth in it. "Tell Lily I said good night." "She's asleep. Tell her in the morning." "All right." He hung up and sat in the quiet of the apartment and thought about the kind of courage that didn't look dramatic from the outside, that looked like a woman on a phone call at 7:30 saying, "I want it on record," and the actual cost of that, not the idea of it. Marcus filed the civil complaint 6 weeks later. The documentation was extensive, the communication records, the payment structure, the timeline, alignment, the capital curtain coordination evidence, Warren Pike's cooperation statements. It was the kind of filing that took up significant space in a federal docket and generated, when it became public, 2 days of coverage in the financial press that was categorically different in tone from anything Gideon Rourke's coordinated network had managed to produce. Because this wasn't a story about a CEO's erratic judgment or a controversial security consultant or leadership stability concerns. This was a story about a man who had spent over a year systematically attempting to destroy a company through bribery, information theft, false regulatory complaints, and coordinated media manipulation. It had names, dates, dollar amounts, and communication records. It had a cooperating witness who had been inside the operation. Yes, Grant read the first major piece about the filing on a Thursday morning while Lily was getting ready for school. He'd intervened. She came into the kitchen in her soccer cleats, which she'd apparently decided to wear to school, and he didn't have enough bandwidth to address that particular choice right now. "Dad, you're reading about the bad guy?" "I'm reading about a court filing." "About the bad guy," she confirmed, peering at his phone over his shoulder with unabashed curiosity. "Why are you wearing your cleats inside?" "I couldn't find my regular shoes." She grabbed a piece of toast. "Is the bad guy in trouble now?" He set the phone down. "He's going to be in a lot of trouble." "Yeah." She chewed her toast thoughtfully. "Good," she said, with the simple moral clarity of someone who had not yet learned to dress up judgment in qualifications. Then she disappeared back down the hallway, presumably to find her actual shoes, her cleats clicking against the hardwood. He looked at his phone. He looked at the filing summary, at the names and the amounts and the careful legal language that wrapped around something that had been underneath it all. A simple and old story, a man with power who couldn't tolerate a woman who'd built something he wanted and couldn't take. So he tried to take her apart instead. He thought about what it cost Warren Pike. Not the legal cost, the human cost, 8 years of loyalty spent and then sold. A career ending not with retirement, but with cooperation agreements, and the particular humiliation of having everyone who'd once respected you understand exactly what you chose to be when you thought no one was watching. Warren had cried in that boardroom. Whatever that meant, strategic or real or both, it had meant something. The way all human failures ultimately mean something, even when the choice behind them was unforgivable. He wasn't absolved, but he was human. That was the uncomfortable truth that Grant had to sit with sometimes, that people who do terrible things are usually not monsters in any clean sense. They're people who made a decision they couldn't unmake, and then made it again and again until the decision became who they were. That was its own kind of punishment, and it started before anyone found out. The FTC closed the regulatory inquiry, without action 7 weeks after the civil filing. The letter to Celeste's legal team was brief and formal, which was exactly the right length and tone for something that should never have existed in the first place. Marcus framed a copy and put it in a folder with the rest of the documentation, because that was the kind of lawyer he was. He kept the receipts. The Hargrove Capital stake held through the entire period. Their senior partner sent Celeste a handwritten note after the regulatory closure, which, in the current era of institutional investor communication, was so anomalous that Dana Park thought it was junk mail and almost recycled it. Celeste read it at her desk and then put it in a drawer that she kept for things she wanted to not lose. The 2 former board directors resigned from 2 other boards they sat on in the 3 months following their departure from Arden Nexus. Public statement was made connecting the events. Needed to be. Gideon Rourke's civil legal defense was, as expected, expensive and aggressive. He retained one of the more prominent litigation firms in the country and filed 17 motions in the first 60 days, which Marcus addressed with the methodical patience of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by volume. The case would take years. These things always took years. But the documentation was solid, and the cooperation's witness was specific, and the record was public. And in the financial community, which ran on reputation and information, the record being public was more consequential than any courtroom ruling. 3 of Rourke Capital's largest institutional investors reduced their positions in the 18 months following the filing. Official reason was stated. The financial press connected the dots anyway. Gideon didn't disappear. Men like him rarely did. But the territory he operated in contracted in ways that were quiet and cumulative and permanent. The next company he circled pulled back before he could position himself. The deal he'd been building in Austin fell apart when 2 of his key partners withdrew without explanation. His annual conference appearance in Scottsdale received, for the first time in 11 years, a panel slot rather than a keynote. Was not destroyed. He was diminished. In certain environments, that was worse. The Arden Nexus Charity Gala was held on a Friday evening in late November in the kind of downtown venue that had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Sound that turned the city into something resembling its own postcard version. Celeste had been planning it for months. It predated everything, had been on the calendar before the Café, before Grant, before any of it, and she'd been mildly determined not to let 14 months of coordinated sabotage take it from her as well. Grant came in a dark jacket that fit like he'd had it a long time. Lily was with her friend Marisol for the evening, which Lily had accepted after extracting a promise that Celeste would come to the next soccer game, a commitment Celeste had made without hesitation. The event was full, 400 people, Arden Nexus employees and community partners, and the kind of civic leadership that showed up for these things when the company had a functional reputation worth associating with. Celeste worked the room the way she always worked rooms, with genuine attention to the person directly in front of her, which was rarer than people realized, and which was probably why people remembered conversations with her long after she'd forgotten them. Grant stayed near the edges of the room. Not invisibly, he wasn't hiding, but in the way he mocked spaces, positioned where he could see the architecture of everything, without being in the center of it. Old habit. He'd stopped apologizing for it internally some time ago. He was standing near the windows, looking at the Sound, when he felt Celeste beside him. He hadn't heard her cross the room. "You don't like these," she said. A question. "I don't dislike them." He looked out at the water. "I'm just better at the perimeter." "I know." She stood beside him. Close, but not the careful professional distance of their early weeks. Just close. The way people stand when they've stopped performing the management of space between them. "I want to tell you something I've been thinking about." "Okay." "I've been trying to understand what you actually did. For this company." "For me," she paused. "Because the easy version is you identified the leak. You built the case. You helped us expose Warren. That's the factual version. That's what's in the documentation. That is what happened. But it's not the whole thing." She turned to look at him. "The part that's harder to document is that you told me to take threats seriously before I understood why. You told me not to change my behavior around Warren until I was ready to move. You told me the pattern of his carefulness was its own evidence. She paused. Of that is in the legal filing. No, of that shows up in the risk assessment. But every single one of those things changed how I approached this. Changed what I was able to do. He looked at her. You would have gotten there. Eventually. She shook her head slightly. But not the same way. And possibly too late. She looked back out at the water. You didn't solve it for me. That's the thing I keep coming back to. You made sure I was standing on solid enough ground to solve it myself. He thought about his daughter on a soccer field, pointing at both of them after a goal, about yellow rain boots aimed at puddles, about a small girl who could read a room almost as well as her father, and had apparently decided within 4 minutes in a parking garage that this was someone worth including. He thought about what Lily had said to Celeste, or what Celeste had told him. Lily said that he was good at helping people, but didn't always know when to let them help him back. He was still working on that part. Lily said something to me once, he said. On the way back from the park. She said, I sound more awake when I'm talking to you. Celeste was quiet for a moment. She told me something, too. At the gala tonight, actually, I called her before I came, to check in. She smiled at the window. She said, Celeste, are you going to be at my dad's house for Christmas? He blinked. She did not say that. She absolutely said that. She's 8 years old. She's 8 years old and she asked me a direct question, and I had absolutely no idea what to say. She turned to look at him. For the record, he looked at her. She looked back. The city moved behind the glass, the lights on the water, the bridge in the distance, the ordinary, gorgeous fact of a place that didn't care about any of this and would look exactly the same tomorrow. I told you I don't move fast, he said. You did. And I told you Lily comes first. You did. And I told you that I'm not. He stopped. I'm not easy, I know. Her voice was quiet. I'm not either. I work too much, and I overthink, and I have a company that requires more of me than most people would be willing to live around. She paused. We're both a lot of work. Yeah, but I think she stopped. Tried again. I think the things that are actually worth something usually are. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the question of whether a person could rebuild a thing they thought they'd finished building, whether the version of a life you'd settled into could expand without losing what made it stable. He'd asked himself that question in various forms since Lily's mother died, and the answer he'd arrived at, slowly, over years of picking Lily up from school and reading bedtime stories and watching her aim for poles. The answer was that the question itself was the wrong shape. You didn't rebuild a life. You didn't replace what you'd lost. You just kept living in it. And sometimes living in it meant it grew in a direction you hadn't planned. Come to Christmas, he said. She blinked. What? Lily asked you a question. The answer is yes. He looked back out at the water. Come to Christmas. Celeste Arden, who had built a billion-dollar company from nothing and survived a 14-month campaign to dismantle it and sat across from her own board while they voted on her future, stood at the window of her company's charity gala and felt completely unprepared for a two-word sentence from a man in a dark jacket who had once gone back to reading his book like nothing had happened. She's just that. Simple. The word landing the way true things tend to land without drama, without needing anything extra around it. Christmas was loud, in the way that holidays with 8-year-olds tended to be, and Grant's apartment was small enough that the loudness had nowhere to go but everywhere. Lily has insisted on 3 different kinds of cookies, 2 of which were successful, and 1 of which emerged from the oven as a mystery substance that nobody was willing to definitively characterize. Celeste sat on the kitchen floor with Lily while the oven cooled, sorting the successful cookies from the questionable ones, and Grant stood at the counter, making coffee. Nobody was going to drink for another 20 minutes, and watching the 2 of them argue about whether a cookie that had partially merged with another cookie counted as 1 cookie or 2. It's 1 cookie, Lily said, with the certainty of a child who has decided. It's just a big one. It's structurally 2, Celeste said. They just happen to be touching. That's the same as 1. That's actually a philosophical position, Lily, not a fact. It is a fact. Lily picked up the merged cookie and held it toward Grant. Dad, 1 or 2? He looked at the cookie. He looked at his daughter, who was sitting on his kitchen floor with a billionaire, arguing about cookie taxonomy with complete seriousness. He looked at Celeste, who was looking up at him with an expression that was half amusement and half something much more than that. He said. Lily pointed at Celeste in triumph. That was political, Celeste told him. Probably, he agreed. He handed her a coffee, and she took it from him, and their fingers touched, and neither of them moved away, and Lily had already moved on to the next urgent business of the day, which appeared to involve arranging the successful cookies in a pattern that was meaningful to her. The apartment was warm. Outside the window, December was being December, cold and early dark, and indifferent to everyone's plans. The city carried on. Grant leaned against the counter and looked at the two of them on his kitchen floor and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, the specific quality of a moment that didn't need to be anything other than exactly what it was. He'd meant 11 years learning how to protect people from the kind of danger that announced itself, and several more years protecting his daughter from the kind that didn't. He had learned, in the way you learn things that cost you, that you cannot protect the people you love from time or loss or the particular unpredictability of being alive. All you can do is be present for what actually happens and honest about what it means and willing to let the next thing be the next thing instead of the thing you already lost. He hadn't always been good at that last part. He was working on it. Lily looked up at him with cookie on her fingers and the unself-conscious certainty of a child who has decided something is settled. "Dad," she said, "this is good, right?" He looked at his daughter. Yes, he'd intervened. He looked at the woman on his kitchen floor, who had come in with 2 coffees to a soccer game and stayed for cookies and philosophical debates and Christmas morning in a small apartment that suddenly felt like it had the right amount of people in it. He said, "This is good." Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to her cookies. Celeste looked up at him over the rim of her cup with something in her eyes that was private and clear and entirely hers. He looked back. Outside, the city carried all its ordinary noise. Inside, it was quiet in the way that only happens when the right people are in the right room, and nobody needs anything to be different from what it is. That was the whole of it. A perfect thing, there would be long work hours, and legal proceedings still grinding forward, and an 8-year-old who had opinions about everything, and a man who moved slowly on purpose, and a woman who had never quite figured out how to stop, running toward the next problem long enough to stand still in a good moment. They were all of them, in various ways, still figuring it out. But the door that Grant had closed for years, the one his daughter had been patiently sitting beside, waiting without pressure. In the way that children wait for things they believe are coming, that door was open now. Thrown open. Not dramatically swung wide, just open. Enough to let the light in. Enough to let someone through. In the end was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough.